I'm Werner Klemm, and on December 7th, 1941, I was a member of the ship's company of the U.S.S. Dobbin, the OBBIN, a destroyer tender anchored off Ford Island in Pearl Harbor, within several hundred yards of the Arizona and the Utah on the one side. Utah one side, Arizona, and the other battleships on the other. And at 5 minutes to 8 in the morning, while waiting to load up on the Liberty launches to go ashore after colors, the airplanes came down off of the mountains, falling like cards from a deck. And I didn't think anything of it because the Army Air Force used to have these drills like that periodically. Only this was a Sunday morning, so that would be the first time for the drills. And there was a loud explosion on Ford Island, and I thought, gee, that's a realistic target today. But what it was the hangar blown up. And when the airplane finished dropping a bomb, it came right over our ship, and there were two big red circles on the wings of the airplane. So our ship rang up fire and rescue. And while I was going to my station, they changed it to general quarters. So we all went to our general quarters station, and I had been in the Navy a year at that time. I went in 1940, and we were fully trained military outfit. And one thing the Navy does is hold drills. So you could do that stuff in your sleep. So whatever they rang up, you ran to your station and did your job. So there was no confusion, but the first 2 minutes is what did the damage to the battleships, the torpedoes and the excuse me, and the bombs were launched before any shots were fired from our side. And the Oklahoma, my job was to handle ammunition, bring ammunition to the 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. We had 4 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. And while I was hustling the ammunition back and forth, I would glance over at these ships getting hit, and at around 8 o'clock, I saw the Arizona go up, and it seemed like the fire went right way up in the sky. I thought, gee, a lot of people getting killed in this one. And at that time, the Oklahoma was already half capsized, and the Utah on the other side, it went over in 9 minutes. That used to be a battleship, but they had made a target ship out of it. So altogether, counting the Utah, there were 9 battleships in the harbor, and they were all disabled, sunk, or some other way. So then later on, I read there were 2 attacks in Pearl Harbor from the Jap, but to me it seemed like they were in the air all morning, steady. So anyway, after a little while, a fella came up to me, asked if I would go in a boat with him, and he and I went in this here 36 motor whale boat, and we went over to the battleships, and we pulled the men out of the water, helped to pull men out of the water out of the burning oil and bring them over to Murray Point, the dock there. And then when we were all finished with that, we hauled rescue equipment, hoses and gas bottles and torches over to the Oklahoma, and they started cutting holes in the bottom because they heard tapping from the men that were in there, you know, couldn't get out. And then we went on one trip when we took the man to Murray Point. There was a lieutenant from the West Virginia wanted to get on his ship, asked us if we'd take him to the ship. I said, well, it's sunk, it's on the bottom. So he wanted to go anyway. So I said, okay, we'll take you. I was the coxswain, and the other man, Grant, he was the engineer on the engine. And in order to get to the little bit of deck that was showing on the West Virginia, it was underwater all but a little piece of deck, and it was tilted. We had to work our way, well, I had to work my way through the debris from the Arizona, and of course everything was burning. And we made it, and I nudged up against a piece of deck, and the lieutenant jumped off. And the rest of the ship was on fire, but he wanted to get back on the ship. So then after the raid and everything, when things quieted down, somebody said that there was coffee and sandwiches being put out. So that was over at Hickam Field. So we walked up from Murray Point up the hill to the hangar on Hickam Field. And it was a pretty, those hangars are pretty big. So they were using that for a gathering place for the survivors to see how many casualties there were. And they had painted the names of the ships up on the wall, like Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Arizona, and of course all the men were huddled under there, were covered with oil, and we had given them blankets, and along the one side was the coffee and the big cases of big boxes of ham sandwiches. And under the Arizona there were so pitiful few men, and that's what sticks in my mind about that day mostly, besides the Arizona going up, the amount of fire that went up there. And then you wouldn't ever think there could be that amount of oil in the water. It must have been 6 or 8 inches thick or more deep. But it burnt. There was smoke coming out of these battleships there until Thursday night, early Friday morning, from Sunday morning. That was the oil and the paint and the cork insulation, everything burned on there. So we were so fearful that there would be the Japanese would be landing there. Everybody thought they would land there because we didn't have anything in the air ourselves. That every ship was assigned a place to run aground or pull ashore, like all the way up towards Pearl City. And they put racks all around the deck with rifles, and all the rifles we had were the 1903 Springfields. and bandoliers of ammunition. So we were going to use these ships for forts to try to keep the Japanese off of the landing. And the Army put up barbed wire all around the beaches, the ends of the harbor, and all around the island, as a matter of fact. And we thought we were sold out, because in November we were out on maneuvers for a couple of weeks, and we got all kinds of sub-soundings. And the whole fleet was on Condition 2. That meant that all the guns were manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So everybody was expecting something. Plus, and then suddenly, the 1st of December, it all disappeared. They put us on holiday routine, so we didn't even have to get up on a Sunday. So back to everything normal. And that was because that Caruso was in Washington speaking with the Secretary of State, but that was a lot of smoke coming out of Washington, because the invasion fleet, well, the task force, Japanese ships, had been underway for 2 weeks already by that time, and nobody spotted them. And plus the fact that about an hour and a half before the air raid, one of our destroyers sank a submarine at the entrance to Pearl Harbor. Plus, by 7 o'clock, the radar man had spotted about 300 planes coming in from the direction opposite from where the planes were coming in from the States. And they told him to forget about them. And the sinking of the sub was reported to Washington and was ignored. So that's the reason we thought the feeling from everybody was that we were sold down the river by Washington. So we lost respect for the officers. Plus, on Saturday night, the Japanese Civic Club had thrown a big shindig for the officers, so there weren't that many officers aboard ship on Sunday morning, high-ranking officers. And a lot of people, enlisted men, refused to salute the officers. You know, they looked disdainfully at them. So for a military organization, they couldn't let that happen too long. So after about a week and a half, 2 weeks, they cracked down and restored the discipline, and things went back to what they used to be. And on the Dobbin, we loaded ammunition for the and bombs for the Yorktown. That's a carrier, for 3 days and 3 nights, 12-hour shifts. And we were one of the auxiliary trains. The other one was the oiler and the hospital ship. And we were the repair ship for the Coral Sea battle. We went to American Samoa, Pago Pago. Then the hospital ship, the Solace, left us there and went to New Zealand. And we went to Tonkataboo. And the task force went over to the Coral Sea battle, the Coral Sea, and they stopped the Japanese forces from invading Australia. So Australia celebrate Coral Sea Day like we celebrate Pearl Harbor Day or Memorial Day, because otherwise the Japanese would have taken over Australia. They didn't have any. They didn't have. Australia was the land size about as big as the United States at that time, the 48 states, and they only had 7.5 million people, and we had 132 million at that time. So we were important for the defense of Australia. And of course, the Lexington got sunk at that battle. And some other ships, we lost more ships than the Japanese, but we sank all of their transports and kept them from invading Australia. And we had offloaded all the bombs to Yorktown, and when the Yorktown came back, they offloaded all the wounded and the dead to our ship and to the shore station there, where eventually they got put in the hospital someplace, Hawaii, I suppose, or I don't know. And then we went from there to the Suva and the Fijis, and then Noumea and New Caledonia, and then to Sydney, Australia, and then to New Guinea, where I transferred to the U.S.S. Mugford, a destroyer. And then I was on the Mugford in 1943 and 44. And we went from one end of New Guinea to the other, and New Britain, New Ireland, the Admiralty Islands, different landings there. And then finally ended up the other end in, I switched to another ship. They sent me to Sydney to put a cargo ship in commission. And we put it in commission in Sydney, Australia, and then I was on that one until early 1945. And with that one, we moved the hospital from Brisbane to Hollandia, then from Hollandia to Manila, and then we went to Morotai and Halmahera in the East Indies, and they dropped me off in Manila in the Philippines, and I had to find my way to Olongapu, which is around Bataan Peninsula. And then we start building that Subic base there. Subic City was 5 miles from Olongapu, but they called it Subic. And that became the biggest naval base in the Pacific eventually. So that's where I was when the war ended. And I came home in October of 1945 from the middle of 1941. And then I re-enlisted on the U.S.S. Mugford in 1944, January, for another 4 years. and I wanted to vote. You know, you had to be 21 to vote. So I voted for Roosevelt. And anyway, when the war ended, I got married in Kentucky, and I had 2 more years to go. And I was supposed to get a tanker in Norfolk, but I missed it. It didn't stop. And the way things worked out, I was the base blacksmith in Norfolk Naval Base there. And they sent me to Little Creek to work with the underwater demolition and the Marines practicing landings. And I did that for 2 years and got discharged there. And then that was in the regular Navy, 2 hitches in the regular Navy, 8 years. And then I enlisted in the reserves in 1953 until 1957. But then that was the end of that because I had to choose between a home life or, you know, my wife being in Kentucky and me being in the Mediterranean. And
you say no more. I understand. No, fantastic. You know, you were at the beginning of America's involvement in the war, and you were at the end of it too, which is really. You were at the beginning of the war.
Yes.
You were at the absolute end of the war. I mean, you literally, you're one of the few people who served the entire time.
Yeah.
And that is so admirable. I want to ask one last question, if I may. It was something that boggled me about Pearl Harbor specifically. And I hate to go into too much detail, but can you describe for me when you were in the boats, in the lifeboats, going up to the Arizona and going up to the Utah, to Battleship Row on December 7th? Can you describe for me what you saw in the water, and tell me everything again, if you know, everything you saw?
Well, the main thing was the amount of oil was all on fire, and a lot of these guys were burnt up in the oil. You know, apart from the explosion, quite a few guys had bad burns, and then you actually didn't know how many were alive that you pulled out. We couldn't go right into the burning oil. We'd have to try to get it out from the edge, the men, and some of them you would grab them, and everything was slippery with oil. And then sometimes it would be skin coming off. You'd think it was just the oil, and then the skin would be burnt like that. So we just loaded the boat up, and those that were able would help us get them out. There were only 2 of us to do this. And when the boat was full, we'd take it to Murray Point, unload. There were people unloading, and we weren't the only boat. The Dobbin sent quite a few boats, and the battleships, they had these admiral barges and captain's barges there. They were right on the scene from the beginning, and they, with all these boats, they got the men out pretty well. And when it came to the Oklahoma, after the people were all out from the rest of the water that we could see, then once in a while around the Oklahoma, somebody would pop up out of the water. They would work their way down. They'd have to swim through the water and then up.
Tell me about that.
Well, the people think, you know, when you see the movie, you boom, boom, you know. But there's so much noise all the time. It's steady. It's nothing in between. It's constant. But the smoke, the smell from all of that, every time ordnance goes off, you get the gunpowder smell, and you got the smell of the oil and the paint, and of course people burning and all that mixed in together. So the smell sticks with you. It's so penetrating that you can taste it sometimes, you know. But the noise goes away. It makes you deaf for a while. But the smell, you remember the smell? I do anyway.
Well, yeah, no, this is...
I stayed in the boats night and day until Friday. Finally, I just get a little cat naps during the night while we're waiting to load or unload or something like that. We, to show you how ill-prepared a lot of the ships were, most of them had only target ammunition. So we had to go over to Westlock, the ammunition depot, and load up on service ammunition. And that's what we were doing most of the rest of the week, hauling service ammunition to these ships. And of course, other equipment, you know, to repair the boilers and get different things working, parts and food and stuff like that. And about, I'd say, a good half of the personnel at that time were young fellas, 18, 19, 20 at the most, because they were enlisting people like mad. You know, they declared an emergency in 1939, and they started drafting people. See, it's supposed to be 1 year service. Goodbye, dear. I'll be back in a year, but didn't happen.
Is that how you? Did you join or did you get drafted?
Oh, I enlisted. Yeah. It wasn't easy neither. I was up in the CCC in Montana when they dropped the age to 17. That was the only service to do it, the Navy. So I hitchhiked to Butte, 32 miles, 25 below zero, and I passed. They took me. So I went back to the camp, and they were all excited. They wanted to get in the Navy, you know. So another 16 people went over there to enlist. And out of the 16, only one passed. So the two of us went down to Salt Lake City together to get sworn in, and down to San Diego, where we went through training. And it shows you how tough it was to get in. 2 men out of 17 were physically fit. And everybody was working hard there in the woods, timber and stuff like that. But a lot of these people were from the east side of New York. And they weren't getting the food to... I don't know why they weren't physically fit. I know I had to work from when I was old enough to, I know when I was about 4 years old, my father had me working on his machine on Saturdays, cleaning it in the factory. So.
No, that's fantastic. I didn't realize that you were in the CCC. I didn't realize you were in the CCC, so.
Yeah, well, when I got in there, I mentioned it to somebody, and they told me, you better not tell anybody, keep your mouth shut. He says, because they call them the 10% cut. See, in order for Roosevelt to finance the CCC, he had to get the money someplace, and that's what he did. He cut the armed services 10%, their pay.